Welcome to Drishtikona with Aruna Devi, where modern Hindus are given the intellectual tools to explain and defend Sanatan Dharma. In this first episode of the series, three modern Hindus discuss the challenges of being Hindu in an unfriendly global culture, and I introduce them to Drishtikona as an useful civilizational tool to counter anti-Hindu prejudice.
Can I be honest? Sometimes I genuinely don't know how to explain being Hindu anymore. I still feel emotionally connected to it. Festivals, temple visits, family traditions. But if somebody asks deeper questions, I freeze.
Same. And honestly, sometimes I feel nervous even bringing it up publicly. Because the moment you say something positive about Hinduism, people immediately become suspicious. Like you're saying something dangerous.
And that is exactly what worries me. I don't think your generation hates Dharma. I think many of you simply don't know how to stand on it confidently anymore.
Because every space tells us something completely different. At home, protect tradition. Online, Hinduism is oppressive. At work, religion should stay private. At college, all religions are basically the same anyway. After some time, you stop knowing what you are even supposed to believe.
And every option feels emotionally dangerous. If you hold too tightly to tradition, you're called backward. If you adapt too much, you start feeling disconnected from yourself.
You know what scares me the most? Not criticism from outside, confusion inside. Because when I was younger, even people who were not deeply religious still had civilizational confidence. Now I see hesitation everywhere. Even educated Hindus speak about their own civilization defensively.
That is because many modern Hindus inherited rituals, but never inherited Drishtikona, the lens, the ability to see life clearly through Dharma.
But what does that actually mean? Everybody says Dharma constantly. Half the time I honestly don't even know what people mean anymore.
Fair question. Dharma is not merely ritual. It is not internet pride. It is not political anger. It is not blind traditionalism. Dharma is a way of understanding human life. What strengthens a human being? What weakens a human being? What strengthens family? What weakens family? What leads toward clarity? What leads toward confusion?
And why do so many Hindus feel lost right now? Because honestly, a lot of people my age genuinely do feel lost.
Because modern life constantly pressures people to live without stable frameworks. You are told to create your own morality, your own identity, your own truth, your own meaning. But nobody teaches human beings how to choose wisely. So eventually, people become emotionally exhausted. Not because freedom exists, but because they have no lens guiding freedom. And without a lens, even intelligent people become confused.
That actually describes exactly how a lot of us feel. Like we inherited pieces of something important, but not the ability to explain it confidently.
And that is where the real journey begins.
You know what I think changed? Earlier generations lived inside one moral framework. Now young Hindus are forced to live inside many at once.
Yes, you start monitoring your own thoughts before anybody else even reacts. Like, can I say this publicly? Will people misunderstand me? Will this sound intolerant? After some time, you stop speaking naturally altogether.
That is the real danger. Not disagreement, self-censorship. Civilizations weaken when their own people become hesitant defending them.
Because once a civilization loses confidence in its own lens, every external framework begins appearing wiser than its inheritance. And eventually, people stop evaluating ideas through dharma. Instead, they evaluate dharma through external ideologies.
That actually happens constantly. Even when people discuss Hindu traditions, they immediately judge them using modern assumptions first.
And the moment a civilization loses confidence in its own categories, its intellectual dependence begins. Not all collapse begins through invasion. Some collapse begins through imitation.
So people become disconnected, even while still technically remaining Hindu?
Yes, because identity without Drishtikona eventually becomes symbolic rather than civilizational. Ritual survives, but clarity weakens. And once clarity weakens, confusion multiplies very quickly.
Honestly, sometimes it all just feels emotionally exhausting. Every issue becomes complicated immediately.
Exactly. How traditional should we remain? How modern should we become? What should never be compromised? And every answer online feels extreme somehow.
And because those questions become emotionally exhausting, people escape into simplifications. Some escape into blind modernity, some into outrage, some into total silence.
And social media makes it worse. Everything becomes either fully reject tradition or blindly defend everything. There's almost no space left for honest thinking anymore.
Because confusion cannot be shouted away, it must be clarified. And clarity requires something modern life increasingly discourages: stillness, reflection, patience, civilizational memory.
Civilizational memory?
Yes, a civilization survives partly through memory, not merely historical memory, moral memory, psychological memory, spiritual memory, the accumulated wisdom of what strengthens human beings across generations.
And modern life constantly pushes people toward the opposite: short term emotion, short term validation, short term trends.
And once everything becomes immediate, human beings lose the ability to think civilizationally. Then confusion stops feeling temporary. It starts becoming permanent.
Modern society keeps repeating things like, just be spiritual. Do whatever makes you happy. All truths are subjective. At first, those ideas sound compassionate. They sound freeing initially. But somehow, people still seem more anxious than ever, more emotionally lost because unlimited choice without orientation becomes psychologically crushing after some time.
That's an excellent insight, because modernity gives enormous freedom, but very little orientation. People are told to choose everything, but almost nobody teaches them how to choose wisely. A civilization that abandons stable frameworks eventually produces widespread psychological exhaustion, not because people lack intelligence, but because they lack orientation.
So freedom itself is not the problem?
That's right, because freedom without clarity is the problem. Because eventually, human beings become emotionally overwhelmed by permanent uncertainty.
That actually describes modern anxiety very accurately. People constantly fear making the wrong life decisions. Career, relationships, identity, beliefs. Everything feels unstable. And eventually people become emotionally exhausted, trying to reinvent themselves continuously, right?
Right. Because modern culture increasingly teaches human beings to construct themselves entirely from personal preference. But preference alone cannot sustain stable civilizations, nor stable minds. A civilization that abandons stable frameworks eventually produces widespread psychological exhaustion, not because people lack intelligence, but because they lack orientation.
So if modern life creates this much confusion, how did Dharma traditionally understand the problem?
Aha, now we get to meat of the question. The Kaṭha Upaniṣad explains this with extraordinary precision. It says, Śreyas and Preyas manushyametah, to samparitya vivinakti dhiraha. Shreyo hi dhiro abhipreyaso vrinite, preyo mando yogakshemad vrinite. The good and the pleasant approach a human being. The wise distinguish between them. The wise choose Śreyas. The unwise choose the merely pleasant. Human beings constantly encounter two paths, Śreyas and Preyas. Śreyas is what strengthens long-term clarity, discipline, character, wisdom, responsibility. Preyas is what feels immediately comforting, approval, convenience, pleasure, validation.
And modern society constantly pushes people toward prayers.
Constantly. Comfort begins replacing wisdom. Approval begins replacing truth. Convenience begins replacing responsibility. And after some time, people stop asking, what is right? They only ask, what is easier? What is safer socially? What feels emotionally comfortable?
That actually explains a lot. Difficult conversations become almost impossible now because people immediately fear discomfort, or social isolation, or being judged publicly. And eventually, people become internally exhausted trying to satisfy both simultaneously.
And once fear of discomfort becomes dominant, the mind slowly begins dividing against itself. One path seeks truth, another seeks approval. One path seeks dharma, another fears consequence. Because contradictory frameworks eventually produce psychological fragmentation. And modern civilization increasingly normalizes that fragmentation instead of healing it.
So the problem is not merely confusion. It's that people no longer even trust themselves to recognize Śreyas clearly.
And once a civilization loses the ability to distinguish Śreyas from Preyas, clarity collapses very quickly.
But this kind of inner conflict wasn't just modern, right?
Great question. No. Even Arjuna faced it.
Arjuna, the warrior from the Mahabharata?
Yes. His crisis was not lack of intelligence, nor lack of courage. It was moral paralysis. Arjuna himself says, Karparnya doshopahata svabhavaha, prichhami tvam dharma sammudha chetaha, yachreyah syan nishchitam, bruhi tanme shishyasteham, shadhi mam tvam prapannam. My nature is overcome by weakness. My mind is confused regarding dharma. Tell me clearly what is truly good for me. I am your disciple. Guide me, for I take refuge in you.
And when you think about it, that sounds extremely modern. Duty, emotion, family, compassion, fear, civilizational consequence, all colliding simultaneously, especially when every moral framework gives different answers.
Arjuna stood between competing emotional realities, and modern people increasingly experience the same thing. And notice something very important. Krishna did not shame Arjuna for confusion. He did not say, your emotions are meaningless, nor did he say, just follow your feelings. Instead, he restored clarity, step by step, through dharma, through perspective, through discernment. So the Gita is not merely a religious sermon, it is psychological reconstruction. Krishna restores Arjuna's ability to see clearly again. That is why Drishtikona matters. Because confused people rarely need more outrage. They need clearer vision.
And modern society gives people almost unlimited stimulation, but very little clarity.
Yup, which is why so many intelligent people now feel emotionally disoriented, despite having enormous information. Information alone does not produce wisdom, perspective does.
Maybe our Kurukshetra is not a battlefield anymore. Maybe it is modern life itself. Like when somebody suddenly says, Hinduism oppressed people. And even if you disagree, you immediately feel uncertain how to respond clearly. Or when social approval quietly demands silence about your own traditions. Not openly, subtly.
Bingo. Those are modern Kurukshetras. Moments where competing frameworks collide inside the mind. And slogans are not enough to navigate them. You need a lens.
And most people don't actually have that lens anymore, which explains why even successful people often feel internally fragmented now.
You're absolutely right. Because modern education increasingly gives people information without civilizational orientation. So people become technically informed but psychologically unanchored. External success does not automatically produce internal coherence, especially when a civilization loses shared frameworks for meaning.
And social media probably intensifies that fragmentation constantly, which probably makes genuine self-understanding almost impossible after some time.
Absolutely. Because modern digital culture continuously rewards reaction, not reflection, speed, not wisdom, performance, not depth, and eventually, human beings lose the ability to sit quietly with difficult truths. And without self-understanding, clarity collapses very quickly.
So what exactly is Drishtikona supposed to be? A lot of conversations online already claim they are protecting Dharma. But many of those conversations just become outrage loops. Either endless anger or endless defensiveness. And after some time, people stop thinking clearly altogether. They only react emotionally.
Drishtikona is not outrage content. It is not political screaming. It is not blind traditionalism. It is not emotional tribalism. Drishtikona is how modern Hindus learn to think clearly again. A place where confusion is examined through dharma, not through panic.
So the goal is not merely defending Hinduism emotionally.
No. Because emotional defense without clarity eventually becomes unstable. People must understand why Dharma says something, not merely repeat slogans.
That actually feels very different from most online conversations. Usually people are pressured to immediately pick sides.
But real clarity requires examination, reflection, nuance, discernment, not merely emotional loyalty.
And civilizations probably weaken when emotional identity survives. But deeper understanding disappears.
Because identity alone cannot sustain civilization permanently. Civilization survives when people understand what must be preserved, why it must be preserved, and what happens when it collapses. So Drishtikona is really about recovering civilizational clarity, not forcing people, restoring sight.
So what kinds of questions are we actually going to examine in this series? Because honestly, modern Hindus are struggling with a lot right now.
Identity, relationships, marriage, family expectations, tolerance, boundaries, even basic questions like, what should never be compromised?
And larger civilizational questions too. How civilizations weaken, how cultures dissolve, how moral frameworks disappear slowly.
Those are all great questions. In this series, we are going to examine many such real questions modern Hindus struggle with. Not superficially, seriously. Through Shruti, through Smriti, through Itihasa, through Yukti, through lived civilizational experience.
So not merely opinions.
No. Because civilizations cannot survive permanently on opinion alone. They require rooted frameworks, tested frameworks, accumulated wisdom.
And probably the courage to ask uncomfortable questions honestly.
Because avoiding difficult questions does not preserve civilization. It weakens it quietly. And modern people increasingly avoid uncomfortable questions entirely, because modern culture increasingly trains people to fear discomfort more than confusion. But Dharma often requires the opposite, temporary discomfort, to avoid long-term collapse.
That actually changes how you think about difficult conversations completely.
And that is the journey this series begins.
So, where does somebody actually begin? Because these problems feel enormous sometimes.
By learning to ask better questions. Not merely what feels good, but does this strengthen buddhi or weaken it? Does this strengthen family or weaken it? Does this preserve dharma for the next generation or quietly dissolve it? That already changes how modern decisions look completely. Because dharma trains human beings to think in terms of consequence, not merely impulse. Modern culture increasingly trains people to ask, what do I want immediately? Dharma asks, what kind of human being does this create over time? That difference is enormous, because modern life constantly encourages short-term thinking, career, pleasure, validation, consumption, and civilizations slowly weaken when short-term gratification consistently overrides long-term stability.
So, Dharma is not merely about rules. It is about preserving conditions that allow human beings and civilizations to remain healthy.
That is why dharma cannot be reduced merely to personal preference. Because civilizations are not built from preference alone, they are built from disciplined continuity across generations. That actually makes dharma feel much more practical than people assume. Because true dharma was always practical. It was never merely symbolic spirituality. It was civilizational psychology.
So dharma has to become visible again, not performative, but actually lived.
Yes. Because children inherit what they repeatedly see, not merely what they are told. If reverence disappears from daily life, eventually reverence disappears from memory itself.
And modern families increasingly outsource almost everything now. Education, morality, identity, values. Sometimes even basic civilizational continuity.
Yes. But civilizations survive through lived transmission. Children must see discipline, gratitude, reverence, self-restraint, duty. not merely hear abstract lectures about them.
That actually explains why many people feel emotionally disconnected from their own traditions. Because they inherited rituals, without seeing deeper meaning embodied consistently.
When dharma becomes reduced merely to occasional ritual, while daily life follows completely different values, fragmentation begins. And eventually, younger generations stop believing the tradition itself is serious. Because human beings learn authenticity partly through observation. If a civilization publicly praises dharma, but privately lives entirely through consumption and imitation, future generations notice the contradiction. And once children stop seeing confidence and coherence, they begin searching elsewhere for meaning. Civilizations rarely disappear suddenly. Usually, they dissolve gradually through interrupted transmission.
I understand better now why no civilization survives automatically. That is something modern people increasingly forget.
Yes. Civilizations survive only when enough people continue understanding what must be preserved, why it matters, and what happens when it disappears. And if that understanding weakens, future generations inherit fragments instead. Festivals without meaning, identity without conviction, ritual without clarity. And eventually, civilizations begin weakening from inside.
Not only because they are attacked externally, but because they stop understanding themselves internally.
Yes. External pressure becomes far more dangerous once internal clarity collapses. Because confused civilizations become psychologically dependent very easily.
Which probably explains why modern societies become so vulnerable to ideological imitation.
When civilizational confidence weakens, imitation begins appearing more sophisticated than inheritance. And eventually, people start viewing their own civilization primarily through external categories.
Which means they slowly lose the ability to think from within Dharma itself.
Yes. And once that happens, civilizational continuity becomes extremely fragile. So confusion is not merely personal anymore. It becomes civilizational. Because civilizations are ultimately sustained inside human minds first.
Honestly, this already feels very different from most conversations online. Usually everything becomes emotional immediately, or ideological, or tribal. Very few people actually help others think clearly anymore.
That's because the goal here is not control, nor blind conformity. The goal is clarity.
And honestly, modern Hindus are starving for clarity more than they realize.
Yes. Because confusion eventually exhausts the mind emotionally, especially when human beings must constantly navigate competing moral frameworks without stable orientation.
That actually explains why so many people feel psychologically tired all the time now. Even intelligent people.
Because intelligence alone cannot stabilize human beings. Orientation matters, meaning matters, civilizational rootedness matters.
So, Drishtikona is really about rebuilding orientation gradually, episode by episode, question by question.
Exactly. Not through panic, not through hatred, not through emotional manipulation, but through clearer seeing.
Which honestly feels increasingly rare in modern public conversation.
Yes. Because modern discourse increasingly rewards certainty without reflection. But Dharma requires the opposite: humility before truth, patience before judgment, discernment before reaction. That is why it already changes the emotional tone of the conversation completely. And that is the journey this series invites people into. This is what Dharma teaches. Not because Dharma seeks to control you, but because Dharma understands consequence. Krishna did not force Arjun. He restored Arjun's clarity. And then he left the choice to him.
That may be the most important part. Guidance without coercion.
Yes. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Vimrishya tadasheshen yathechhasi tatha kuru. Reflect deeply upon this completely, then choose as you will. So Dharma does not remove choice. It teaches us how to choose with clarity. In the same way, I will always leave the choice to you. Reflect deeply, question honestly, think carefully, and let Dharma sharpen the lens through which you see the world. Drishtikona.
So where does the next conversation begin?
In our next episode, we will examine a modern idea many Hindus have been taught to repeat automatically, that all religions are basically the same. But we must be precise. Most traditional religions do not actually claim this about themselves. Christianity does not say all religions teach the same truth. Islam does not say all religions lead to the same conclusion. Many other traditions also make distinct truth claims. So the real question is not, why do religions claim they are all the same? They usually do not. The real question is, why have many modern Hindus been erroneously taught to say this?
So, Christianity and Islam, for example, don't accept that there are many paths to God. They are exclusionary in their doctrine. This is more like a modern Hindu confusion.
Exactly. A growing modern tendency, especially only among deracinated Hindus and secular universalists, claims that all belief systems are fundamentally the same in moral and civilizational consequence. That is the idea we must examine carefully.
Meaning, not just whether religions use similar words like love, peace, or morality, but whether they actually produce the same kind of human beings and societies.
Do all worldviews produce the same understanding of truth? The same understanding of family, freedom, duty, society, power, human purpose? Or do different belief systems ultimately produce different kinds of civilizations, different kinds of moral frameworks, and different kinds of human beings? And if those differences are real, then pretending they do not exist would be dangerous. Because compassion does not require blindness. Respect does not require confusion, and pluralism does not require Hindus to erase discernment. So the issue is not hatred toward others. It is whether Hindus are allowed to see clearly, or are expected to show suicidal empathy to openly hostile ideologies that want to eliminate Sanatana Dharma. And if those differences are real, what happens when Hindus are taught to stop recognizing them? That is where we continue next. Drishtikona. So join us soon for that discussion. Jai Bharat, Vande Mataram, Namaste.
Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Jai Bharat, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Jai Hind, Namaste.